As the door to the ancient tomb creaks open, the foul stench of decay fills the air, wrapping around the team of researchers. What lies beyond is not just a treasure trove of unimaginable riches, it's a discovery that could rewrite history itself. But among the glimmering artifacts and the ancient relics, there's a chilling message: "Cursed be he who moves my body." What happens next is the stuff of nightmares. One by one, the researchers begin to meet their untimely ends in ways more horrifying than you can imagine. This might sound like the opening of a Hollywood horror blockbuster, but this story isn't fiction, it's real life. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're diving into the foreboding world of cursed tombs. Any self-respecting theater kid will tell you that Shakespeare was no stranger to curses. The curse surrounding the play Macbeth is so well known that most actors today still refuse to say the play's name inside a theater. Instead, they call it the Scottish play. Some superstitious thespians won't even say the name out loud at all, anywhere. But Shakespeare's connection to curses doesn't end there. There's one that goes beyond the stage and into his grave. William Shakespeare, widely known as the greatest English playwright of all time, died in 1616 and is buried at the Church of the Holy Trinity in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. In true Shakespearean fashion, his grave is inscribed with a creepy little poem: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." This epitaph was written by the man himself to help remember his work, or possibly as a way to scare away any potential grave robbers. Shakespeare lived in a time where grave robbing was a pretty serious problem. Bodies were often dug up and sold to medical schools for use in experiments. Oddly enough, the ominous warning is the only inscription marking the grave of the playwright. His ledger stone doesn't even have a name. The only hint that it's Shakespeare's final resting place is because it's surrounded by other members of Shakespeare's family. Above the grave, sometime before 1623, a monument was erected featuring a stone statue of the bard himself, immortalizing him in stone. Another odd thing is that his grave is much shorter than his wife's, and he wasn't buried in a coffin but wrapped up in a sheet. For centuries, Shakespeare's eerie words have kept people on edge, even in modern times. The curse still casts a shadow. In 2008, when the church housing his grave underwent renovations, workers went to great lengths to avoid disturbing his bones. Even historians looking to examine his remains are a bit suspicious of the warning. In 2015, Professor Francis Thackeray from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, said he would use laser surface scanning to create a digital copy of Shakespeare's remains without having to move the bones. He also joked that maybe teeth wouldn't count as bones. However, the idea of taking Shakespeare's teeth for study turned out to be more difficult than expected. In 2016, when a scan of the grave was finally conducted, marking the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, it was discovered that Shakespeare's skull was completely missing. This baffling discovery sent researchers on a hunt for clues. That led them to a story published in Argosy magazine in 1879. According to the story, in 1794, a grave robber named Frank Chambers stole Shakespeare's skull and sold it to a private collector for 300 British pounds, which is about $56,000 in today's money. Presumably, the buyer wanted to reenact his favorite monologue from Hamlet with Shakespeare himself standing in for Yorick. Originally, the story of the bard's stolen skull had been dismissed as a work of fiction, but given that the skull was actually found to be missing, there might have just been some truth to it. So far, nobody has been able to locate the skull, and nobody knows what happened to Frank Chambers, or the person who supposedly bought the skull from him. Perhaps they were just lost to history. Maybe it was the curse of Shakespeare's grave at work. After all, there's really no way to prove that either of them were ever seen alive after handling Shakespeare's stolen skull. From jolly old England, let's head north to check out the grave of Seath Mor Scorfiacla. Seath Mor, a 14th century Scottish chieftain of the Shaw clan, was no stranger to battle. As a member of the fierce-clad Chattan Confederation, he took part in the Battle of Northinch in September of 1396. This wasn't just any battle. It was a staged conflict between the Chattan Confederation and Clan Cuil. History is unclear on some of the finer details of the conflict, but everyone is clear on one fact about Northinch. The Chattans emerged as clear winners. Each side fielded 30 warriors, and while the Chattans suffered 19 casualties, the Cuils faced utter devastation. Only one man survived. In his life, Seath Mor had a reputation for being a fearsome warrior, and perhaps it's because of that his burial site has earned a reputation of its own. Seath Mor is buried in the churchyard of St. Tucaldus on the grounds of the Rothiemurchus estate, about 80 miles outside of Aberdeen. Seath Mor's final resting place is marked by a gravestone that reads, "The grave of Seath Mor of Scorfhaiachlach, victor in the combat at Perth in 1398. Today the grave is covered by a mort safe, a type of iron cage meant to protect the grave from being robbed. Beneath the cage, 5 cylindrical stones rest on top of the grave, and according to legend, every single person who has ever tried to move the stones has met with a terrible fate. In the 1800s, an English footman reportedly died after he threw one of the stones into the river. He was the footman of the Duke of Bedford who was passing through town, and he'd heard the legend of the curse from some locals. This footman was a skeptic, and he felt like he ought to prove the superstitious locals the curse was bogus. So he picked up one of the stones from Seath Mor's grave and hurled it into the nearest river. 4 days later, the stone was found again, washed up further down the river. The Duke of Bedford's footman was also found, having fallen in and drowned. The next death attributed to Seath Mor's curse was a journalist in the 1940s who had come to Rothiemurchus to write an article about the curse. He, like the footman, wasn't a believer, and while researching the story, he picked up one of the stones and raised it over his head in a mocking fashion. According to legend, he would later come to regret his actions as he would get in a fatal car accident on the drive back home. Then in 1978, the stones were implicated in the ill fortunes of 3 separate men who were working on renovations for the churchyard. According to the Aberdeen Evening Press, Leslie Walker and his 2 friends were working in the graveyard, and Leslie decided to stop and show Seath Mor's grave to his buddies. Despite the threat of the curse, he turned one of the stones over so his friends could get a proper look at it, and wouldn't you know it, he was rushed to the hospital with a 103-degree fever that very same night. Leslie was hospitalized with a mystery illness for 6 weeks, over the course of which he lost 19 kilograms. While Leslie survived long enough to at least give an interview with the paper, his friends weren't as lucky. Leslie had only touched one of the stones. Apparently, one of his friends had touched all 5 of them. His body was found in the graveyard the next day, where he apparently suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. The 3rd friend, who hadn't touched the stones at all, was hospitalized around the same time as Leslie for severe stomach pain. And that's just a few of the instances where the stones were moved, stolen, thrown in the river, or otherwise vandalized. While we can't confirm if every would-be vandal met a grisly fate, the grave's sinister reputation didn't stop people from trying their luck. Soon, it started to become a nuisance for the people who owned the land the grave was on. Cases of the stones being moved or taken became so common that the estate gravekeeper, Jimmy Gordon, eventually had the mort safe installed in 1983. Since then, there have been no more mysterious deaths attributed to the grave of Seath Mor. The mysterious deaths and the cursed stones are just one part of the legend around Seath Mor's grave, though, because even if you can't move the stones anymore, the grave is said to be guarded by his ghost. Sightings of a large, shadowy figure are often reported in the woods around the churchyard at Rothiemurchus. The ghost of Seath Mor is said to challenge travelers to battle, echoing the many battles he won in life. If you stand your ground and face him, the ghost will disappear and he'll leave you alone. But if you show cowardice, you risk offending the ghostly chieftain, and if you run away, you may never be seen alive again. In addition to the ghost of Seath Mor himself, the grave is also supposedly guarded by a spirit called the Bordach an Dún, or the guardian of the grave. In Gaelic folk traditions, many clans had guardian spirits associated with them, and Bordach an Dún was said to be the patron spirit of Clan Shaw. When Clan Shaw owned the Rothiemurchus estate, Bordach an Dún had free roam of the grounds, but now that the ownership has passed over to the Grant family, he's tethered solely to Seath Mor's grave. True believers of the curse believe that Bordach an Dún is the one responsible for all the deaths brought on by the stones being moved. And speaking of restless spirits of great warriors, next let's take a look at Timur's curse. Timur, also sometimes called Tamerlane, was a Mongol conqueror who lived and ruled in Central Asia during the 14th century AD. In addition to being a great patron of the arts who brought about a cultural renaissance in the region, he's widely considered one of the greatest and deadliest military tacticians in history. Timur died in the winter of 1405 when he fell ill while encamped at Farab, in what's now Kazakhstan. Once Timur died, his body was embalmed with musk and rosewater before being wrapped and placed in an ebony coffin. He was then sent to his final resting place in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. As Timur had been a great appreciator of art and architecture, he was buried in an appropriately lavish mausoleum called Gur-i-Amir. If this tomb's domes, columns, and geometric courtyard look familiar, that's because the design of this tomb went on to influence the architect who built the Taj Mahal. Gur-i-Amir was constructed between 1403 and 1404, but its original purpose wasn't to house Timur's remains. Instead, it was meant to be the final resting place of Muhammad Sultan, Timur's grandson and chosen heir, if he hadn't died in 1403. Timur himself wanted to be buried in a smaller tomb near his palace, but since it wasn't complete at the time of his death, he was buried in Gur-i-Amir. The tomb still stands to this day, but visitors should know that disturbing his coffin may come with deadly consequence. Timur had supposedly continued to add to his impressive body count from beyond the grave. Rumors of the curse began all the way back in 1740 when the Persian ruler Nader Shah conquered Samarkand as part of his great Central Asian campaign. Samarkand had particular significance to the Shah. Like all great rulers, he knew his history, and apparently he was a pretty big Timur fanboy. So naturally, when he took the city, he wanted to bring Timur's ebony sarcophagus back to Persia with him as a souvenir. But when he tried to move it, it broke, so he settled on taking a jade slab instead. The slab was supposedly engraved with the phrase, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." Nader Shah had no way of knowing what a bad idea this was. As soon as the Shah took the slab home, he discovered that his son had fallen extremely ill. His advisors gave him the very solid advice of putting the jade slab back where he found it, and according to legend, as soon as he returned it, his son started to get better. 200 years later, in 1941, a team of Soviet anthropologists were tasked by Joseph Stalin with opening Gur-i-Amir to confirm whether or not Timur was actually buried there. The leader of the expedition was a Russian named Mikhail Gerasimov, and working under him were a crack team of Central Asian scholars and preeminent Russian academics. And of course, the whole affair was covered extensively by journalists and documentarians looking to capture any potential discoveries. According to multiple accounts from the day, a group of 3 old men came into the tea house where the research team was meeting on the day the tomb was set to be opened. They approached one of the lead scientists, Sadruddin Ani, with an old manuscript that they claimed warned of a terrible curse on Gur-i-Amir. Despite the desperate pleas of the old men, Ani dismissed their warnings as nothing more than superstition. He continued the excavation, convinced that the curse was just a story made up to scare away grave robbers. The crew tried to inspect the manuscript further, but since none of them spoke Persian, it was impossible. When the tomb was opened, the team was immediately hit by a thick, overpowering stench. As if on cue, the lights began to flicker erratically, and the camera equipment started to flicker and short out. They had an electrician check everything out, but he was unable to determine a cause. Still, they went through to the burial chamber and set about opening the coffin, which was engraved with the words, "Whomsoever opens my tomb will unleash an invader even more terrible than myself." Ominous. But other than those few weird happenings, the rest of the dig went off without a hitch and nobody experienced any fatal accidents. They were successfully able to transport Timur's corpse back to the lab for study. Seemed like the curse was just a story after all, until a few days later, when Russia was invaded by Nazi Germany. News of the curse spread throughout the Soviet Union like wildfire, and when Stalin heard about it, he ordered that Timur be returned to his tomb by special aircraft. He was finally reburied in November 1942 with traditional Islamic rites. 5 weeks later, Russia had its first major victory in the war at the Battle of Stalingrad. To believers, it looked like the curse was lifted. As good as this story is, though, there's very little evidence that it's anything other than a poorly timed coincidence. Even though the incident with the old men at the tea house definitely happened, the story of the curse wasn't written down in detail until 1990, when an article about it was published in the magazine Zvezda Vostoka. Between 1941 and 1990, there was a lot of time for details to get forgotten or embellished for the sake of a good story. Most of the Soviet scientists on the team didn't speak Persian, so any claims about what spooky phrases were written on the tomb are probably greatly exaggerated. Historians believe that the engraving on Timur's coffin was likely a prayer for the deceased, while the jade tablet's inscription was probably a list of Timur's ancestors. Such details were typical for the tombs of great Mongol rulers of the time. Timur's tablet might not have been engraved with a curse, but the tablets found in the Keramikos necropolis definitely were. The Keramikos necropolis in Athens dates back to the Bronze Age. It's a sprawling complex that extends outside the ancient city walls and over both sides of the Eridanos River to the north of the Acropolis. It marked the beginning of the Sacred Way, a road stretching from Athens to Eleusis, a path steeped in history and tradition. It was here, in 431 BCE, that the Athenian general and politician Pericles delivered his famous speech known as the Funeral Oration in 431. Numerous archaeological digs have taken place there, and the research suggests that people were burying their dead in Keramikos as early as 1200 BC. The first excavation of Keramikos started in 1870, but archaeologists didn't start uncovering anything creepy until the early 1990s. In 1992, during construction for a new metro station, workers uncovered what turned out to be a pit full of at least 89 individual bodies. These remains were dated back to the 4th century BC, and the nature of the pit seemed chaotic and hastily put together. These facts suggested that these bodies were victims of the Great Plague of 430 BC, which was described in the writings of Thucydides. But surprisingly, the pit full of plague victims isn't the cursed part of the Keramikos necropolis. That honor would have to go to the well that was uncovered in 2016. Located at the edge of the necropolis, the 2,300-year-old well was found to have 30 inscribed lead tablets bearing curses. Some of them were shaped like coffins, others had nails driven into them, but all of them were inscribed with prayers and incantations written by angry ancient Athenians wishing harm on other people. Some of the tablets only contain names, but many of these curses go into more detail and ask for the gods to drag the target of the curse to the underworld. One tablet calls on Persephone to curse a woman named Tibytus, her husband, and their 3 children because they did the curse writer wrong in some way. Another tablet curses a pair of professional boxers and some well-known local prostitutes whose names come up in other contemporary sources. Another, more theatrical curse tablet binds its subject to dishonor before all gods and humans, and a particularly nasty one curses the genitals of a woman named Glycera, who must have been the curse writer's ex-girlfriend. Now, it might seem weird and ominous to hear that a well in an ancient graveyard was full of dark spells carved into creepy black tablets, but to the ancient Greeks this would have been a perfectly logical place to put them. Until the 4th century BC, it was pretty common to find cursed tablets in tombs. This was before the politician Demetrius of Phaleron introduced new legislation that restricted the kinds of burial rites people were allowed to perform, in an effort to stamp out the practice of black magic. As with most restrictive laws, though, it didn't stop the practice of performing curses in graveyards. It just meant the sorcerers had to be a little sneakier. Instead of burying curse tablets in specific tombs, they started anonymously dropping them down the well. The reason why they picked the well specifically is that water, especially groundwater, was strongly associated with death in ancient Greek culture. To them, all underground rivers lead into the river Styx, a mythical river that carried souls to the afterlife. And if you dropped something in a well that was fed by an underground stream, the current would eventually pass it along to the underworld. In a way, the well functioned as a metaphysical complaint box. If you had an earthly grievance to address to Hades or Persephone, you could simply drop it into the well, confident that your message would in time reach the rulers of the underworld. From ancient Greece to modern-day Tokyo, now let's check out the curse of Taira no Masakado. Taira no Masakado was a samurai who served the house of Fujiwara no Tadahira in the 10th century AD. Masakado is famous in Japanese history for starting an uprising in the country's historic capital of Kyoto in what would become known as the Johai Tengo Rebellion. Not much is known about his early life, and it's unclear what actually started the rebellion. Some say it was over a woman, others believe it was a dispute over who would inherit the land of Masakado's uncle, Taira no Kunika. But whatever the reason, it sparked a massive conflict between Masakado and his paternal uncle, Taira no Yoshikane, who was the vice-governor of Kazuha province at the time. This conflict escalated until it became an all-out war between the two sides of the Taira clan, where both Masakado and Yoshikane rallied literal armies to fight with him. Even though Yoshikane had thousands of soldiers and Masakado only had 100, Masakado was the victor. And despite the huge number of casualties he was responsible for, Masakado was pardoned in court due to the advice of his lord, Fujiwara no Tadahira. In 939, Masakado led another uprising where he killed the local governor and captured 2 provinces. This led to Kyoto putting a bounty on his head. And 59 days later, Masakado was killed by his cousin, who chopped off his head and brought it to the capital. The head ultimately found its way to a fishing village called Shibasaki, which would be the future site of the city of Edo, or present-day Tokyo, where his grave remains today. At present, it's located at exit C5 of the Otemachi subway station in Tokyo's financial district. Over time, Masakado's legend grew and took a turn for the supernatural. It was said that his head kept moving and speaking for months after his death, demanding to know where his body was. In some villages, he's viewed as a demigod figure, and the locals leave offerings to him at shrines to ensure good fortune. He's also sometimes referred to as an onryo, which is a type of vengeful spirit in Japanese folklore. Other legends have to do with a swarm of butterflies heralding his arrival in Kyoto, and his daughter Takayasha being a witch. With all of these legends associated with Masakado's death, it's no wonder then that the shrine where his head was supposedly buried is said to be protected by a curse, bringing ill will on anyone who disturbs it. After the earthquake of 1923 damaged the original gravesite, the Ministry of Finance drafted plans to knock it down and construct a building on the plot of land. However, the plans were quickly cancelled when a number of construction workers as well as the Minister of Finance himself died of mysterious causes. Then, during the American occupation following World War II, the shrine was set to be moved, but this was also cancelled due to a series of mysterious accidents. Ultimately, none of these stories can be proven or disproven except for one. Some people have said that none of the buildings around Masakado's grave have windows, so that people can never look down on him. That one is just a straight-up lie. You can see Masakado's grave from a number of buildings in the financial district. While we can't be sure how many deaths were caused by Masakado's restless spirit, we know exactly how many people were killed by the curse of Casimir's tomb. The tomb of Casimir IV, who was the king of Poland from 1447 to 1492, is located in the Holy Cross Chapel of Krakow's Wawel Cathedral. The king died of unknown causes at the age of 64 in Grodno, Belarus. It was a particularly hot summer's day when he passed away, so in the time it took to transport him 347 miles to his final resting place in Krakow, his body had decayed rapidly. To try to mitigate the decay, they sealed his wooden coffin with textiles and resin. Casimir's tomb was built between 1492 and 1496 by a German sculptor named Veit Stoss, who lived in Krakow for 20 years. Casimir IV had a very successful reign. He brought Prussia under Polish rule, which allowed Poland to gain access to more resources, strengthened their ties with Western Europe, and bolstered the kingdom's economy. Even in death, he was able to pass on his success to his subjects, since his tomb attracted so much attention that Veit Stoss was commissioned to build a whole series of royal tombs around the city of Krakow. But Casimir IV's legacy would also come to include something a lot more sinister and a lot more deadly. Between 1972 and 1973, the Wawel Cathedral authorities decided it was time that the Holy Cross Chapel got some renovations. Part of this project would involve opening Casimir's tomb. This would require them to get permission from the Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła, who, in an interesting side note, would go on to become Pope John Paul II. Permission to open the tomb was granted in May 1973, and from there a team of 12 conservationists would examine the tomb to assess any damage that had been done to it, as well as the best way to go about refreshing it. When the tomb was opened, the conservationists found the remains in a terrible state. The wooden coffins were decaying and covered in centuries-old mold. So they cleaned the tomb, replaced the coffins, and once the renovations on the chapel were complete, they reinterred Casimir and his wife Elizabeth's remains in a service that took place in September of 1973. But just a few months later, something weird started to happen. The members of the conservation team started to unexpectedly drop dead. Felix Danczak died in April 1974. Then Kazimierz Hurlak died in August of that same year. By the end of 1975, 10 of the 12-man team were dead of mysterious causes. Naturally, the press went wild, spreading rumors that Casimir IV might be Poland's own homegrown King Tut. So what was the truth behind the rumors? Well, remember those rotten, moldy wooden coffins? They were tested by microbiologist Boleslaw Smyk, and they were found to be covered in a fungus called Aspergillus flavus. Aspergillus flavus can grow on almost any crop, causing extremely quick decay. While it's not impossible for a human to survive exposure, there is no known animal with a natural resistance to its effects. That's because the spores of this fungus contain substances called aflatoxins, which are some of the most carcinogenic substances known to man. In addition to causing cancer and hepatitis, exposure to aflatoxins can cause cell necrosis, liver failure, and a weakened immune system. And now, the granddaddy of all cursed tombs, King Tut. That's right, we've saved the most famous cursed tomb for last. Tutankhamun was an ancient Egyptian pharaoh who lived during the 18th dynasty and ruled from 1332 to 1323 BC. he ascended the throne at just 9 years of age, after a short but eventful reign in which he established relations with the Mitanni people of northern Syria and revitalized the classical Egyptian pantheon after the empire briefly shifted to monotheism. But his reign came to an abrupt end. He suddenly died at just 18 years old. Due to how unexpected his death was, the royal tomb was incomplete. He was instead buried in a non-royal tomb in a region now known as the Valley of the Kings. Fast forward to the late 19th, early 20th century, and the Egyptology craze sweeping the Western world. During this period, expeditions to Egypt were being funded by rich people looking to score some ancient artifacts for their personal collections. And the holy grail of Egyptian tombs was, of course, the tomb of King Tut. In 1922, Howard Carter and his team of British archaeologists finally found it. But with the fame and riches that came with making the greatest find of the century, there also came dire consequences. The first weird thing to happen was when Carter's pet canary was killed and eaten by a cobra, an animal that traditionally served as a symbol of the ancient Egyptian monarchy. Then Lord Carnarvon, the financier of the expedition, died from an infected mosquito bite. Howard Carter sent a mummified hand to his friend Bruce Ingham as a souvenir, and not long after receiving that gift, Ingham's house burned down. Then the rebuilt house was struck by a devastating flood. Another Egyptologist who was there at the dig site, Aaron Ember, also had his house burned down in 1926, an event which killed him and his entire family. In 1929, Richard Bethel, another member of the team, was found mysteriously suffocated in his room in an elite London gentleman's club. Even the radiologist who x-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy, Sir Archibald Reed, fell ill and dropped dead within 3 days of performing the scan. Many other people who were there at the dig, as well as some people who merely visited the tomb around the same time, also passed away from mysterious illnesses around the same time. Skeptics of the curse are quick to point out that plenty of people who were at the dig lived full, healthy lives. In fact, of the 58 men who made up the expedition, only 8 died within 12 years of the tomb being opened. Howard Carter himself considered the notion of the curse to be ridiculous and completely antithetical to his work as an archaeologist. However, in May of 1926, he made an intriguing note in his diary. He had spotted a jackal resembling Anubis, the ancient Egyptian guardian of the dead. Some scientists have suggested that some of the mysterious illnesses could have been a result of a fungus or a bacteria present in the tomb, similar to the Aspergillus flavus that was found in Casimir's tomb in Poland. But that doesn't really explain the 2 house fires, or the suffocation, or Lord Carnarvon's blood infection. For now, the so-called curse of King Tut seems to be nothing more than a grim coincidence. Still, if history has taught us anything, it's that some mysteries are better left undisturbed. So perhaps it's wise to think twice before visiting any Egyptian tombs anytime soon. What do you think? Are tomb curses real, or just spooky coincidences? Have you heard of any other cursed tombs that we missed? Let us know in the comments below. Now go watch The Most Evil Places in the World, or click on this video instead.